Today's first talk is Muyi Yang, talking on referentiality and plurality and conditionals. It's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let me share my handouts. Okay, everyone seeing my handout, okay? Yes. Seeing my cursor? Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for Chris for organizing this event. Today I would like to talk about what is known as the referential analysis of conditionals in the recent literature on conditionals. So this is a view that has been mostly motivated by Schlenker, who suggests that conditional antecedents are definite descriptions of possible worlds. He basically says that there is a parallel between sentences in the form of if PQ and sentences in the form the PQ. So for a simple conditional like number 1, if Mary comes, John might also come. Under the referential analysis, the interpretation of the sentence can be roughly paraphrased as the worlds where Mary comes are such that they verify the possibility that John comes. So this is very similar to a predicative construction. And in this body of the literature, this approach has been shown to be successful in capturing a number of conditional related phenomena. Today, I would like to focus on a particular assumption of this approach, namely that the argument that conditional antecedents must refer to plural objects. So we will look at this view in a little bit more details in a second, but the main motivation of this view comes from conditionals that express adverbial quantification. However, because definite noun phrases certainly displays the distinction between singular and plural ones. For instance, of course, the singular, the boy, refers to exactly one boy, and the plural, the boys, would refer to multiple boys. Because we have this distinction in the nominal domain, under the referential analysis, we would expect conditionals to attest this distinction as well. And this is exactly what I'm going to argue today, namely that conditional antecedents can refer to singular worlds after all. And the main evidence comes from a paradigm of conditionals expressing adverbial quantification and those that express modal quantification in Japanese. So our plan today is to first of all look at the plural view in a little bit more details, and then we will try to establish the generalization by looking at how conditional antecedents interact with quantification adverbs and modals in Japanese. And then I will introduce my main idea, which suggests that there is singularity marking in conditional antecedents. And finally, I will show you a dynamic implementation of the idea. Okay, so let's first of all look at why people say that conditional antecedents have to be plural. The main motivation of this view comes from adverbial quantification. So in the literature on adverbial quantification, people have suggested that they do not allow singleton restrictors. So this is shown by the Swartz example here displayed in number 2, which is a minimal pair. When a Neo died, his wife usually killed herself, versus when an Indian died, his wife usually killed herself. The first sentence is reported to be bad, and the second one is acceptable. So what does this contrast tell us? First of all, the predicate die here in the antecedent, it is a once only predicate. So the dying event can only happen once to one agent. And because the antecedent of 2A has a proper name as its subject, this means that the antecedent of 2A describes a unique event, namely a new dying. And the antecedent of 2B, because it has an indefinite as the subject, it means that the antecedent describes multiple events. Each event involves one Indian dying. And therefore, the judgments here, the unacceptability of A and the acceptability of B, suggest that accept the antecedent of B can provide the restrictor of usually, whereas that of to A cannot provide the restrictor of usually. And this suggests that adverbial quantification requires non-singleton restrictors. Now, coming back to conditionals, I think many of you have heard of Lewis's argument about quantification of adverbs in conditionals. So he famously observes that if clauses can restrict quantificational adverbs, and I will call this kind of conditionals Q adverbial conditionals in the following. So for a sentence like number 3, if Mary comes, John usually comes too. We have the quantification adverb usually in the consequent, and the sentence is roughly interpreted as most situation or most cases where Mary comes are situations where John comes. So usually is here ranging over the cases or the situations where Mary comes. Schlenker cites this kind of argument and suggests that under the referential analysis, this means that the antecedent of 3, if Mary comes, has to denote a plural referent. So it has to refer to multiple situations where Mary comes. He further assumes that, furthermore, Schlenker assumes plurality for conditionals that express modal quantification as well. So those are the kind of conditionals that I'm going to call modal conditionals. So for instance, for a sentence like 4, if Mary comes, John might come too. Here we have an epistemic model in the consequent. Schlenker would say that 4 is similar to 3 in that the antecedent has to refer to plural worlds where Mary comes. This is a plausible move for English because, of course, English if conditionals allow both Q adverbial and modal interpretations, as we have seen in number 3 and number 4. But what will become important in the following is that it's not the case that in all languages, any conditional antecedents can restrict both, can occur in both Q adverbial and in modal conditionals. So that will take us to the next section where I look at the basic data regarding Q adverbial conditionals and modal conditionals in Japanese. But before I do that, let me show you the basic profile of Japanese conditionals. So in Japanese, conditionals are obligatorily marked by verbal suffixes or verbal enclitics in the antecedent. So for a sentence in number 5, which means if John comes, Mary also comes, there are at least 4 basic ways of expressing this sentence, where each of them differ in terms of the suffixes or the enclitics that follows the verb kuru, come, in the antecedent. At the same time, conditionals can sometimes also be accompanied by the antecedent initial adverb moshi. So in number 6, if you want to say if John comes, Mary will probably also come. It's okay to say moshi John ga kureba, Mary mo kuru daro. Or you can also leave out moshi from this sentence. With and without moshi, the sentences don't really differ in terms of their meanings. So in the following, in the rest of this section, I would like to establish the following generalization, namely that moshi blocks Q adverbial conditionals, but it does not block modal conditionals. In order to do so, I'm going to draw on 2 distinct type of Q adverbs. So before I show you my observations, let me just show you first of all the distinction between the 2 types of Q adverbs. So in a 2004 manuscript, Hertz observes that not all Q adverbs have to be restricted by conditional antecedents. And he crucially discusses this distinction using the adverb often and the adverb usually. So for the so first of all, with often, he observes that both the Q adverbial and the modal readings are possible. So if you look at the sentence in number 7, If Farrell is in Paris, she often visits the Louvre. The reported judgment is that the sentence is ambiguous between a Q adverbial reading and a modal reading. Under the Q adverbial reading, the Q adverb often ranges over the situations or the cases. Ranges over the situations or the cases of Farrell being in Paris, and the sentence, the paraphrase of the sentence would be: on many of Farrell's visits of Paris, she goes to the Louvre. So the sentence is describing a co-occurrence relations between being in Paris and visiting the Louvre. We are saying that there's a regularity between the two states of affairs. Under the modal reading, the sentence can be paraphrased as: if Farrell is in Paris, she visits the Louvre a lot during that visit. Under this case, the adverb often would be ranging over the interval of Farrell's stay, one particular stay of Farrell's in Paris. So we are no longer ranging over all of the cases of Farrell's visiting to Paris. Okay, so often has both readings. In contrast, Hertz observes that the adverb usually strongly prefers the Q adverbial reading. So if you look at number 8, if Farrell is in Paris, she usually visits the Louvre. The claim is that the reported intuition is that the Q adverbial reading is fine. So usually it can still quantifies over the cases, the situations of Farrell being in Paris. But the modal reading is extremely degraded, if not completely unavailable. So usually in this case, cannot quantify over the interval of Farrell being in Paris. So this is the distinction that I'm going to draw on in the following, and I will refer to the these two types of Q adverbs, the often type and the usually type of Q adverbs respectively. Okay, so here comes our baseline for Japanese Q adverbs. So it seems that we find a similar contrast in Japanese. Where for the often types of Q adverbs, we have adverbs like yoku, often, or tokidoki, sometimes. So I'm just going to read the sentence number 9 first. So 飛行機に乗ればよく気分が悪くなる or 時々気分が悪くなる. If I'm on a plane, I often or I sometimes feel sick. So speakers suggest that the sentence is has both the Q adverbial reading and the modal reading. So that under the Q adverbial reading, we are saying that many or some situations where I'm on a plane are situations where I get sick. And under the modal reading, we are saying that in case I get on a plane, I'll feel sick many times or on and off during that flight. On the other hand, if we turn to look at the usually type of Q adverbs like いつも, always, or 大抵, usually, and the sentence is in number 10. 飛行機に乗ればいつも気分が悪くなる or 大抵気分が悪くなる. If I'm on a plane, I usually feel sick. Speakers report that in this case, the sentence only has the Q adverbial reading. We are always or usually ranges over the situations where I'm on a plane, and say that in all of them or most of them, I get sick. Okay. One caveat here is that Japanese conditional suffixes or enclitics, so these things on the verbs, they also seem to exhibit their own preferences for the Q adverbial or the modal reading. So some speakers prefer one suffix over another in order to get the Q adverbial reading or the modal reading. Here and also the judgments vary a lot across speakers. Here in all of the examples that I'm discussing today, I'm going to use reba because it seems most neutral in terms of which reading it prefers. But I would be happy to talk about that in the Q&A session. Okay, so we have set our baseline. Now we can go on and look at the interaction between moshi and quantification adverbs first. So the observation is that when we have an often type the often type of Q adverbs, and when we have moshi in the front of the conditional. In those cases, ambiguity goes away. So in 11, もし飛行機に乗ればよく時々気分が悪くなる. If I'm on a plane, I often or I sometimes feel sick. So in the previous example where we didn't have moshi, I have said that the sentence is ambiguous between the Q adverbial and the modal reading. Here, as soon as we have added moshi into the sentence, speaker suggested that only the modal reading is available in this sentence. So yoku, sorry. So often and sometimes range over the interval of me being on the plane. Next, moving on to the usually type of Q adverbs. The observation is that with moshi, the sentences themselves get odd. So 12. もし飛行機に乗ればいつも大抵気分が悪くなる. If I'm on a plane, I always usually feel sick. In the previous example without moshi, I have said that the sentence only has the Q adverbial reading. Here, when we have added moshi, it turns out that the sentence itself becomes degraded. And 13 is just another example that has been observed by Magda Kaufman. So, もしメアリが来れば大抵ジョンも来る. If Mary shows up, usually John shows up too. That's also judged to be degraded. Without moshi, it's fine. Finally, there is another type of sentences that express adverbial quantification, namely generic sentences. So in the literature, generic statements are often assumed to contain a covert generic operator, and the interpretation of the covert generic operator is very similar to the Q adverb usually. And it turns out that when we look at generic conditionals, they also appear to disallow moshi. So in 14, we have a sentence that's intended as a description of natural laws. So it becomes night if the sun goes down. In this case, the sentence is okay without moshi, but it becomes very bad as soon as we add moshi. Okay, so that's the interaction between moshi and Q adverbs. Now we can go on and look at the interaction between moshi and modals. When we look at modal conditionals, there seems to be no particular restriction in terms of the occurrence of moshi. So we can have modal auxiliaries like daro in 15, be probable, and kamoshirenai, might in 16. In both cases, we can, the presence or the absence of moshi, they don't really seem to make much difference to the meaning of the sentence. And also, if we look at modal adverbials like 多分, maybe, and ほぼ確実に, almost certainly, these sentences also don't seem to interact with moshi in any interesting way. It's just you have it, you don't have it, it doesn't really make any difference. Okay. So up to this point, I hope my data have convinced you that moshi blocks Q adverbial conditionals, but they don't block modal conditionals. Now, in the remaining time, I would like to establish an account for this generalization. But in order to establish an account, I would like to first of all decompose this generalization into two questions and answer them one by one. So this generalization seemed to raise two important questions. First of all, how exactly do Q adverbial and modal conditionals differ? And second, why is moshi sensitive to that difference? And first of all, let's just look at the difference between Q adverbial and modal conditionals. So the difference between these two types of conditionals is not immediately clear, at least under the standard restrictor, the standard Quater-style restrictor view of conditionals, namely the view that conditional antecedents restrict both Q adverbials and modals. So basically, another way to put this is that Kreuzer's restrictor view was designed to unify these two types of conditionals instead of tease them apart. To give you a sense of what the restrictor view would look like roughly, for a sentence like 19, where we have, so this is a Q adverbial conditional. If Mary comes, John usually comes too. Under the restrictor view, we would interpret the sentence as a quantificational statement where we are saying that most situations, and the restrictor of this quantifier is provided by the if clause, Mary comes, and the nucleus scope is provided by the consequent minus the quantifier usually. So basically this says that most situations where Mary comes are situations where John comes. Okay, so that's what Kreuzer's restrictor view would say. However, in the subsequent literature, many authors have argued that the restrictor view seems to make wrong predictions for model conditionals. And one piece of evidence that is often discussed by authors comes from deontic conditionals. For instance, the conditioning 20. So the sentence says, if the new laws for opening hours pass, salespeople will have to work longer. Here in the consequence, the sentence has the deontic model have to. And what's important is that intuitively, the model have to, in this sentence, it is evaluated with respect to the laws of the law passing worlds. So we want to evaluate the necessity of salespeople working longer with respect to a set of laws, including the new laws for opening, the opening hours. We don't want to evaluate it with respect to the actual laws because the new laws haven't actually passed. So that's the intuition. However, if the antecedent restricts, if the antecedent of the conditional restricts the deontic model have to as is assumed by Kreutzer, then the quantificational domain of have to would be determined by the actual laws. If we do an analogous interpretation of 15 for 20, then we would end up something like 21. So we would be saying that for all worlds that are deontically accessible from the actual world, and those worlds are worlds where the new laws have passed, in those worlds, the salespeople work longer. This is not the correct interpretation, because under this interpretation, we would wrongly predict have to be evaluated with respect to the actual laws, where the new laws have not actually passed. So we don't want this. So following this part of the literature, I will assume that models are not restricted by conditional antecedents. Rather, they are evaluated pointwise at antecedent worlds. For the sentence in 20, this means that the model have to is evaluated at each world, each antecedent world where the new laws for opening hours have passed. Okay. And for Q adverbs, I will just follow Kreutzer and assume that Q adverbs are indeed directly restricted by conditional antecedent. So that's the difference between Q adverbs and models. Now, the second question, why is Moshi sensitive to this difference? Here's what I propose. So I propose that conditional antecedents are different descriptions of worlds or situations that are by default unspecified with respect to plurality or non-plurality, and they can be forced to denote singular reference by Moshi. Now we can put my answers to the two questions together and derive the generalization. And here's the main idea. I have said that conditional antecedents restrict Q adverbs, but they don't restrict modals. And I have said that Moshi enforces the antecedents to refer to singular words or singular situations. Now, when we put one and two together, this would mean that when Moshi is present, the restrictor of Q adverbs is forced to be a singleton. But this is not allowed because adverbial quantification requires non-singleton restrictors, which is what we see from what we have seen from the if and a man dies example. On the other hand, models are not restricted by conditional antecedents to begin with. So this means that they are not affected by whether the antecedent refers to singular worlds or plural worlds. So that's why they appear to be optional in, that's why mostly appears to be optional in model conditionals. All right, so that's the main idea. Next, I will try to show you a dynamic implementation using Brashoviano's framework intentional plural compositional DRT. So bear with me for about half page. After I introduce the basic setup, I will try to not give you symbols, but rather just give you pictures to show you the main ideas. And you can find some technicalities in the appendix for the important lexical items that I discussed. So the basic setup. In this framework, there are 4 basic types: T for truth values, E for individuals, S for variable assignments, and W for situations. I'll just assume that possible worlds are maximal situations. So situations and worlds are of the same type. Information states are sets of variable assignments, so they are type ST things. And at a given point in the discourse, the information available there is represented as a set of information states. And importantly, referentiality is modeled using discourse reference, or DREFs. And there are 2 important types of DREFs that I'm going to discuss. The first type is individual DREFs. So those are things that are functions from variable assignments S to individuals E. And the other type of DREFs are situation DREFs. So those are things from from variable assignments S to situations W. Okay. And how are sentences interpreted in this framework? Sentences denote binary relations between information states. And formally, they are translated as DRS. So a sentence can be translated into this form, where basically it says that a sentence is a relation between an input information state I and an output information state J, where where J has to end up having all of the newly introduced discourse reference. And also J has to satisfy certain conditions specified by this sentence. It's also possible that there is no discourse reference introduced in a sentence. It only requires certain conditions to be satisfied. So it will be in a simpler form like this. The last thing that I need to show you is a particular condition that is going to play an important role in the following, which is the singularity condition. So this is the condition that requires the relevant DREF to store exactly one value relative to each information state. So if we have the condition in 23, this says that the value stored in the DREF U has to be singular. And this just requires that all values stored for U at this info state J there has to be just one value. Okay. And finally, a sentence is true with respect to an info state I if and only if there's at least one way of successfully updating I with the sentence. Okay, so much for the technicalities. We can now go to the pictures to look at how these things actually work. So let me first of all show you how individual discourse reference are introduced to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So let's say we have a sentence in 24. A mouse came, it left. Here we have an indefinite article a and a pronoun it. And obviously it refers to a mouse here. So I'm going to follow the convention in the literature by using superscripts like this one to represent freshly introduced discourse reference. And I'm going to use subscripts to represent anaphorically retrieved DREFs. In this case, it refers to the DREF introduced by the indefinite article. So the sentence here is going to be translated into a sequence of update. Let's suppose that we start in the discourse where we haven't introduced anything. So that will be I0. Then the sentence, the singular, so going to assume that in this case, singular indefinite articles will come with a singularity requirement. So the first step of the update is we are going to introduce randomly individuals to we are going to store into V individuals randomly, but we have to ensure that with respect to each information state, there is exactly one value. So we will have a info state I prime where we store Jerry to V, and I prime prime where we store Mickey to V, and so on and so forth. In the next step, we need to make sure that this individual stored at V is a mouse. And for instance, because we know that Tom is not a mouse, we are going to need to eliminate the information state I prime prime. Okay, and in the last step, we need to ensure that the individual stored at V left. Let's say that in our model, Mickey didn't laugh and Jerry laughed. So we're gonna just we're going to have to eliminate I prime prime. Okay, so basically the interpretation of this sentence is going to be a function. The interpretation of the sentence in 24 is going to be a function that takes us from I0 to a point where in this course where we have I prime and possibly some other information states. Okay, now with these set, we can go on and look at what conditionals look like in this framework. So I assume that conditional connectives like English if and Japanese leba introduce a new situation discourse reference that stores all situations verifying the content of the antecedent proposition. So again, you will see the formal entries in the appendix. But here I just want to show you the idea. So if we look at the examples in 25, if I get on a plane, I usually feel sick. Let's just look at the antecedent first. Here, what leba and if do, as you can see in the superscript, is that they introduce a new discourse reference Q. And what exactly Q looks like is that it's going to store all situations where I get on a plane. So let's suppose, let me make it smaller. So if we again start from a point, if we again start from an information state without anything, then this conditional antecedent is going to we are going to need to store into Q the situations where I get on a plane. Let's say W1, 2, 3. Okay. Now, what does Moshi do? Moshi is like a singular indefinite determiner. So it's like that I have said earlier. It stores exactly one world in each information state. And importantly, when we put Moshi into conditionals, leba is anaphoric. So the conditional connective leba is anaphoric to Moshi and stores a subset of the value stored by Moshi. So that you can see on the indices decorated on the example in 27A, where Moshi introduces a new discourse reference P, and the connective leba co-index with it, it's anaphoric to P, and at the same time introduce a new discourse reference Q. Okay, so what does this, so the interpretation of the sentence goes as you can see in figure 3. We will first need to introduce randomly a set of worlds. We will need to store worlds into P, but at the same time need to make sure that with respect to each information state, there is exactly one situation. So we will therefore end up having an I prime where only W1 is stored to where only W1 is stored for P, and also I prime prime and so on and so forth. And then we will introduce a new discourse reference Q to store the situations where I get on a plane. And importantly, because of the relation between the discourse reference P and Q, the singularity of P is inherited by Q in each information state. So that's why on the right-hand side picture, with respect to each information state, J prime, J prime prime, and J prime prime prime, Q has exactly one value in each information state. And Moshi is responsible for that. Okay, now we can look at what happens in Q adverbial conditionals. So Q adverbs are generalized quantifiers. As you can see in the indices here, they are associated with two derivs. Specifically, Q adverbs express a set relation between two derivs. One anaphorically retrieved derivative Q adverbs, and also they establish a new deriv R that stores their nuclear scope. And due to conservativity of generalized quantifiers, the nuclear scope deriv is going to be a structured subset of the restrictor deriv. Now, what does this mean in conditionals? In conditionals, the restrictor deriv of Q adverbs is provided by the antecedent via anaphora. So if we look at, again, the sentence, if I get on a plane, I usually feel sick. Here, we have said that Leba introduces a new deriv to store the antecedent situations. Now, what happens with Taide usually is that it co-indexes with Q to obtain its restrictor, and at the same time introduce a new discourse referent R to store its nuclear scope. Okay, and eventually the sentence is just going to express a set relation most between the restrictor deriv Q and the nuclear scope deriv R. So again, if we start from an info state without anything, we will first of all store into Q the situations where I get on a plane, let's say W1, 2, 3. And then we will store into R a set of worlds where I feel sick. Let's just say I only feel sick at W1 and 2. And then finally, when we look at, we need to check whether this set relations is satisfied by the information state J, namely whether the situations stored in the Q column and the situations stored in the R column stand in the most relation. And in this case, because they do stand in the most relation, this information state J pass this test. So the sentence is true. Okay. Now, what about when Moshi is present? I have said that the singularity restriction enforced by Moshi is inherited by the deriv storing the antecedent situation. So in the case of 27, if I get on a plane, I usually feel sick. That would mean that both P and Q are forced to be singular. And because Taide has its restrictor, Taide has to obtain its restrictor via anaphora from Leba. This would mean that the restrictor of the Q adverb also has to be a singular one. Okay. Now, when we look at the update of this sentence, we actually don't even need to look at it step by step. If we just jump ahead to look at the input information the input of this most relation between Q and R, it's very easy to see that the restrictor discourse referent Q has exactly one situation with respect to each information state, K1, K prime, K prime prime, and K prime prime prime. However, since adverbial quantification requires non-singleton restrictor, as I have said, this means that this most relation cannot successfully update any of its input information states. Another way to put it is that as soon as we have Moshi, the sentence is bound to be false because none of the input information states of the set relation can successfully be updated. Okay. Finally, moving on to modal conditionals. Modals, I assume that modals are also generalized quantifiers. And as you can see here on the indices on might or kamoshirennai, the anaphorically retrieve, so these models anaphorically retrieve a deref for their evaluation world. So that's the subscript P that you see on these models. And just like Q adverbs, they express a set relation between a restrictor deref Q and a nuclear scope deref R. But what's different from Q adverbs is that both Q and R are established by the model itself rather than being anaphorically retrieved. For simplicity, I'm going to assume a very simple model semantics where there is an accessibility relation that's translated as two-place lexical relation. So you have a epistemic accessibility relation between two situation derefs, or deontic one, or what have you. Importantly, the restrictor deref Q here, if you just look at the word here, Q is going to store the worlds that are accessible from the world stored in the evaluation world P. Okay. Now, when we put models into conditionals, what happens is that the evaluation world deref is provided by the antecedent via anaphora. So if we have the sentence, if Mary comes, John might also come. What happens is that we have, again, Leba introduces a new deref storing worlds where Mary comes. And Kamoshirenai has its evaluation world Q co-indexing with the deref introduced by Leba. So that's its evaluation world. So when we look at the update that this sentence amounts to, when we translate them into our language, obviously this has one more step compared with the Q adverbial conditional conditionals that we have seen. And that's the step where we are introducing a new discourse reference to store the situations that are epistemically accessible from the world where Mary comes. So let's say that if at all worlds, we will epistemically access W1 and W3. This is going to be the info state J is going to be what we get. And eventually, the sentence is going to express a sum relation between the deref R and the deref S. So we're going to check whether the situations stored in R and the situations stored in S stand in a sum relation. So that's basically how this works. Now, what happens when we have Moshi is that Moshi does not enforce the deref storing the restrictor of the models to be singular. Specifically, the deref storing the antecedent worlds. So again, so the sentence is 31A. If Mary comes, John might also come, where we have a Moshi imposing a singularity constraint. The deref storing the antecedent world Q, so that's Leba, it is forced to be singular in each information state, which is what we have seen earlier with Q adverbial conditionals. However, in this case, the restrictor deref R is not. It is not because there is an epistemic accessibility relation that enables R to be established with respect to each world stored in Q. When we look at the pictures, again, we don't need to look at it step by step. If we just look at the input information state of the sum relation, namely the one where we have K prime and K prime prime, here the restrictor deref is going to be the R column. And thanks to the epistemic accessibility relation, although with respect to each information state, K prime and K prime prime, Q indeed is going to have a singular referent. But R, the restrictor discourse referent, does not have to. And this is why the sentence is not bound to be false, because with respect to each information state, it is not bound to have a singleton restrictor. And that's the reason 31A can be interpreted unproblematically. Okay, let me conclude. So I hope to, I have established a referential analysis of conditionals where number neutrality is the default option and singularity can be overtly marked. In addition, with the independent assumption that, with the independently motivated assumption that Q adverbs but not models are restricted by conditional antecedents, we derived the generalization that MOSI blocks Q adverbial conditionals, but it does not block modal conditionals. Okay, I have some remaining issues here, but I think I'll stop here and discuss it if anyone is interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice talk. We have roughly 15 minutes for questions. So see if we have questions. Questions, Yimei Shang.
Hi, very, very nice talk. I have two really minor questions. So one is the last example as well as the example right before section 5.4. So it's the two pictures. Then you, in the end, you said that the sentence will be judged as false versus the sentence will not be judged as false. Why would you call this to be false or true? Because I thought that since you're describing the sentence as something that is kind of odd, why not treating it as like presupposition failure as opposed to being false?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I haven't actually thought about this very deeply, but my current response would be that I'm calling it false as a theoretical way of calling how to rule out this sentence, because in this particular framework, if I have understood it correctly, there is no distinction between presupposition failure and false, so they are treated as the same. Yes, so that's basically yeah. If you cannot interpret a sentence, you're just gonna output a like an absurd information state, and that's also the case for falsity. So I guess that's why I was sloppy using these languages. But yeah.
I see. Another clarification question. So you mentioned like R, for example, you mentioned sometimes you say R and S stand in a some relation or R and S stand in the most relation. Could you just clarify what you mean by those relations?
Yes. Thanks. Let me see if I have the entries spelled out. No, I don't. Sorry. But basically, the idea would be that hold on. Let's say if we just look at this figure 5, this if we want to test whether the input of this most relation can be updated, can be updated. This would mean that with respect to each information state, so let's look at K prime first, we will collect all values that are stored in Q and collect all values that are stored in R, and we see whether those two sets stand in the most relation. And we do the same for K prime prime and do the same for K prime prime prime. So
what
but
is
in
the
this
most,
case,
what is the most relation?
Oh, that's just the regular set in terms of set theory. So most things stored in Q are in R, are also stored in R. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Yusuke Yagi, next question.
Yeah, hello, thank you for the talk. I only have small comment. It's kind of a data question. I don't know if directly related to your talk. I'm thinking about unconditional instead of just a conditional, like whenever or whoever comes, I usually verb in Japanese. So I don't think, you know, PCDLT doesn't in itself has any account for unconditional, but I feel like, you know, unconditional stores and world and individual, and you know, in each assignment is updated by the consequent or kind of thing. So my gut feeling is that it involves distribution in perseverance sense. And if that is the case, I thought you would predict that the unconditional is incompatible with the Q adverb reading of the quantifiers. because we have a distribution. So I feel like, maybe since each assignment is evaluated independently, individually. So like since each assignment only has one word, of course, the keyword verb is gotta be incompatible with that. Or maybe we have some information about it. I don't know. And actually, my judgment is a mess. And I mean, I tried several times, but I still do not see if unconditionalizing is compatible with the keyword verb rating or not. I'll try later, but it might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, thanks. This is a good point. I haven't actually thought about this in the context of PCDRT. I'm not sure whether really unconditionals should be predicted to be bad in PCDRT, because it depends, because in my account, it would depend on whether each, so you have two disjuncts in the antecedent. It would depend on whether each disjunct really refers to one single word, or do you mean like it should be bad when moshi is present?
Yeah, so I don't know, because whereas the instance of quantification always involves distribution, right?
Yeah.
I mean distribution over assignment.
So yeah,
like, if
yeah,
each assignment
like
is, yeah, maybe I got PCDLT wrong, or I mean maybe I'm based on some other version of PCDLT, but I feel like if there's a distribution, since each assignment is evaluated, I mean, individually, I felt like, maybe there's something going wrong with the keyword verb.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I need to think a little bit more about the prediction of PCDRT for unconditionals. I think it's too early for me to say what the prediction is until I really work out what's happening there.
I'm sorry that I cannot give you a clear judgment about it. Well, we can talk about it later, I think.
Yeah, I'll have more questions for you. Thanks.
Okay, Yinan Sun next.
Hi, Muyi. Thanks for the very nice talk. I also just have a very minor question. So I wonder for the conditional antecedents with moshi, like, is there a difference if you, so first of all, I don't know, like, if a plant there in Japanese, like in the Japanese version, is a singular or not. So I wonder, like, is there a difference if you change the indefinite into like plants, like a plural? So something like moshi, I get on plants, I usually feel sick. Then could you get the quantification rating? And yeah, if you can, then like, is it compatible with your analysis that moshi is kind of forcing, like providing like stores exactly one word in each information state? Yeah.
I see. I might need you to repeat what you said again, but yeah, the short answer is there is no distinction between plurals and singulars on inanimate subjects, so you can't see that. And could you mention again what's the prediction, what your thought was for why that would matter?
Yeah, because I think so. Because I've read some literature on usually with and often, but that's on the event quantification domain. So I kind of recorded people kind of say that if the restrictor, if whether the indefinite in the restrictor is singular or not kind of makes a difference. So I just wonder if like there's a actual difference, like if you have a plan versus plans or whatever, like that could have a distinction in Japanese, would that also interact with how whether moshi can provide the the singular the reading and the model reading? I just wonder if there could be a correlation such that it's not just moshi is playing a role determining which reading is available, but also the same thing in the moshi conditional antecedent. Yeah, but if there's no distinction in Japanese, then that's fine. Then
yeah, thanks. Yeah, morphologically, there's no distinction. I also didn't know the literature that you mentioned, so I'll ask you later.
Oh yeah, sure, thank you.
Okay, other questions? I'm going to slip in a question of my own. So Aviv, go ahead.
Just a naive question based on 9 and 11.
Okay.
So 9 is ambiguous and often and sometimes are interpretable as Q adverbials. You add moshi and this interpretation disappears.
Yes.
Is it like a feasible option that moshi itself is a Q adverb? And so it's in complementary distribution with other Q adverbs?
You mean like they're competing for the same syntactic position or something like that?
Yeah, and also there's only one semantic slot of a Q adverb interpretation.
Actually, yeah, I'm not sure about the competition for the same syntactic positions account, but actually I think another way to put what I understood that you wanted to say is actually the other way around, is to say that maybe moshi itself is an epistemic model or something like that. So that as long as it is present, the thing underneath just, it cannot be generic or it cannot be Q adverbial anymore. But that actually is a hypothesis that Magda Kaufman has proposed when she first observed this kind of data. So she basically says that moshi is itself an epistemic necessity model. And that's why when you plug it in, you can't have the Q adverbial reading anymore. You only have the epistemic model reading. But one problem for that account is that moshi is not an epistemic model in plain non-conditional environments. So it only occurs in conditional antecedents. So if you think that it is an epistemic model itself, you would have to work out some, I suppose, syntactic stuff or some compositional stuff to make sure that it only occurs in conditional antecedents. And I wasn't able to do that. So that's why I switched to a different account.
Right. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, my question was about the basics of most and how you get most to interact with worlds and situations. So I haven't looked at this in a long time. A long time ago, though, the way that things were done was in a situation semantics, and you would say most minimal situations in which such and such occurs can be extended to another situation where something else occurs. But what looks like what you have here is most situations in which such occurs are also situations where something else occurs. That's talking about non-minimal situations. And the problem I have is that means you're quantifying basically over worlds, and I don't know how to determine whether most worlds have such a property when worlds get into infinities of infinities of infinities.
I'm not sure if I completely understood this. So your worry is about whether, in this case, I'm not extending minimal situations, but rather just quantify over situations regardless of whether they are minimal ones.
Yes. So it's like, are most numbers prime? And the problem is you can set up different ways of ordering numbers so that the answer comes out either way. Despite the fact that primes are fairly scattered loosely throughout the total number line, you could line them up so that every other number is prime, and you start with 2. So 2 is prime, 1 is not, 3 is prime, 4 is not, 5 is prime, 6 is not, 7 is prime, 8 is not, 11 is prime, 9 is not, 13 is prime, 10 is not. And you just order them in that way, and you end up with always having more than wherever you want to cut off. If you're cutting, you always end up with more than half of them being prime. And so you could say most numbers are prime. Or you could say most numbers are not prime, but you don't get a very definite answer to the question. It depends on an ordering relation. It becomes much more complicated. And so I'm wondering how you're going to deal with those kinds of issues if you're using non-minimal situations?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I guess that's a technical fix that need to be done in this framework. And in the original framework, Professor Yano only talked about possible worlds, so he didn't deal with situations. So my gut feeling is that I will have to plug in some features of situation semantics into this framework, which might make it look quite ugly. I don't know. I need to work it out. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we're at the end of our time for this talk. So thank you very much, Muyi. And
thank you.